The wind carried a sharp chill across the barren plains, rattling the wooden shutters of the homestead perched on the edge of the valley. Inside, the hearth glowed dimly, but even its warmth could not chase away the unease that had settled over the house like a heavy fog. A young woman stood by the window, her pale face framed by loose strands of hair that had escaped the confines of her braid. She pressed her hands against the glass, feeling the cold bite through her fingertips, and stared at the horizon where the sun was beginning its slow descent behind distant ridges. She had heard the stories, the whispered warnings of men who spoke of the feared Apache who roamed the lands beyond the river, and now her own father had decreed she must wed him. The thought alone made her stomach churn. She had grown up under her father's watchful eye, learning the rigid rules of propriety, the careful way to keep her hair neat, her posture correct, her words measured. But the idea of leaving everything familiar, of stepping into the unknown and marrying a man whose name brought shivers to the townsfolk, was a terror she had never imagined she could face. And yet there it was, written into her fate by her father's hand, an order that brooked no argument. Evenings like this, when the wind howled and the fire flickered, she could hear it, a voice in her mind that reminded her of what was expected, what must be done. Her father had called her into the study earlier that day, his face a mask of stern resolve. He had spoken in short, clipped sentences, leaving no room for protest. "The man waits," he had said, "and your duty is clear. You will marry him and take your place in his home." She had tried to find reason, to plead for more time, for any excuse that could spare her from this life-altering decree, but he had merely nodded once, sharply, as though her words were dust caught in a sudden wind. Now, standing alone in the dimming light, she wondered what awaited her. The stories were many. Some said he was ruthless, a man of fierce temper who spared no one who crossed him. Others claimed he was fair in his own way, bound by codes older than the settlements that now dotted the plains. No one knew the truth. Perhaps even he did not fully know it himself. She could only imagine the silence that would greet her arrival, the wide, open rooms of a house built from rough-hewn logs, and the eyes that would study her with a curiosity that felt as cold and sharp as the wind outside. The journey itself had been harsh. The trail wound through canyons and across stretches of rocky soil where the grass grew sparse and brittle. Each step had tested her endurance. Each night under the stars had reminded her of how small she truly was in the vastness of the land. She had ridden in a wagon that creaked and groaned beneath her weight, the wooden wheels grinding over stones and dirt. Sometimes the horses stumbled and she felt her body jerk forward with a jolt that made her chest ache. Yet she had pressed on because there was no turning back. She recalled the night before her departure, when her father had handed her a small bundle of belongings. Among them were dresses stitched by her mother's careful hand, a few pieces of silver, and a locket she had worn since childhood. He had watched her pack, saying little, and for a moment she thought she glimpsed a flicker of doubt in his eyes, a hesitation he quickly smothered. She wondered now if he had felt guilt or perhaps relief at sending her away. The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the plains. In the distance, a column of dust marked the approach of a rider. Her heart quickened, a mix of fear and anticipation tightening her chest. Could this be him, the man she was to marry, moving silently across the land toward her, his presence already filling the space she had once thought of as her own? She could feel the weight of expectation pressing down on her, the legacy of her father's command, the judgment of neighbors who had watched and whispered, and the uncertain path that lay ahead. She took a deep breath, trying to steady her trembling hands. The air smelled of sage and soil, a scent so sharp it made her eyes water. She thought of the people she had left behind, the few friends who had wished her well, the neighbors who had offered hurried smiles and whispered blessings, the quiet church at the edge of the settlement where she had learned the hymns she still sang softly to herself. All of it felt distant now, as though it belonged to another life, one that had ended the moment her father's decree was spoken. The wagon came to a halt at the edge of a clearing. She could see a figure waiting, tall and still, framed by the orange light of the setting sun. Even from a distance, there was a presence about him that commanded attention, a quiet, steady power that seemed to make the surrounding air hum with tension. Her heart pounded in her chest, a drumbeat that echoed in the silence between them. She wanted to look away, to retreat to the safety of her father's home, to the life she had known, yet some deep part of her, stubborn and unyielding, forced her to meet his gaze. He did not approach immediately. Instead he stood watching her, the expression on his face unreadable. She noticed the way the wind tugged at his dark hair, the way his eyes seemed to absorb the light around them, dark and penetrating. The air between them was charged, a fragile thread connecting two lives that had never intersected until this moment. She could sense the stories etched into his features, the years of hardship, the moments of solitude, the battles fought and endured. There was a weight to him, a history she could not yet comprehend. Her stomach twisted as the wagon ground to a stop. The horses snorted, stamping the dry earth, sensing the tension in the air. She felt the cold metal of the wagon's edge beneath her fingers as she climbed down, her legs stiff and uncertain. Each step toward him felt like crossing a threshold, not only into his world but into a future she could not yet see. Her breath came in shallow bursts, each inhale sharp and unsteady, each exhale carrying a mixture of fear and resolve. The man said nothing. His silence was deliberate, measured, and it unsettled her more than any words could have. She remembered the warnings again, the murmurs that had followed her since childhood, and she felt a shiver run down her spine. Yet, even in that fear, there was a strange curiosity, a pull toward the unknown that she could not deny. Who was he truly behind the stories that painted him as fearsome? Could there be more to him than the shadows whispered across the settlement? The sun slipped below the horizon, leaving the land awash in twilight. Shadows stretched long and thin, and the first stars began to pierce the darkening sky. The wind softened, carrying with it the scent of pine and dry earth. The silence between them held, tense and expectant, a fragile bridge that might snap at any moment. She could hear her own heartbeat, loud in the stillness, each thump echoing the uncertainty of what was to come. Finally he spoke, his voice low and deliberate, a rumble that seemed to resonate in her chest. He did not offer greetings or explanations, only a simple, steady acknowledgement of her presence. It was not unkind, but it carried weight, as though every word was measured against some unseen standard. She nodded, almost imperceptibly, her throat tight with the effort of swallowing her fear. The moment stretched, taut and delicate, and she realized that nothing she had known before had prepared her for this encounter. As they moved toward the house together, the landscape around them seemed both familiar and alien. The logs of the home rose before her, dark and sturdy, windows glinting with the last light of day. She could hear the creak of the wooden steps beneath her feet, the rustle of leaves in the nearby trees, the distant howl of a coyote calling to the night. Each sound reminded her that she was stepping into a world where her father's rules held no sway, where her every choice, every move would be hers alone to make. The door swung open, and she felt a wave of anticipation and dread wash over her. The house smelled of wood, smoke, leather, and something wild, untamed, as though the land itself had been gathered within its walls. She hesitated on the threshold, her hand resting lightly on the rough-hewn frame. In that pause, she felt the weight of everything she had left behind pressing against her chest. The certainty of a future she could not yet define, and the undeniable presence of a man whose gaze never wavered from hers. She stepped inside and the door closed behind her, sealing out the last remnants of the familiar world. The fire in the hearth flickered and cast long shadows across the room, dancing over the walls and floor in a rhythm that mirrored her own racing pulse. She felt a shiver run through her, not from the cold, but from the realization that her life had changed in an instant, that the path before her was uncertain and fraught with both danger and discovery. And yet, in that uncertain darkness, there was a spark of something else, curiosity, resilience, and perhaps even a strange hope that she could navigate this new world and find her place within it. The man watched silently, and she wondered what thoughts flickered behind his eyes, what judgments or questions he held, what secrets lay hidden in the lines of his face. She knew only one thing for certain: nothing would ever be the same again, and the story of the pale bride had only just begun. The hearth crackled, sending sparks into the dim room, and she could feel the weight of the silence pressing in from all sides. The man moved with careful deliberation, lifting a bundle of firewood from the corner and placing it beside the flames. His movements were precise, economical, yet there was an ease in them that suggested a life lived close to the land, a familiarity with things most would overlook. She studied him quietly, noting the scar that ran along his forearm, the calluses on his hands, the way his eyes, dark and steady, missed nothing. Every detail seemed to speak of experience, of survival, of a life shaped by rules far older and harsher than her own. He finally spoke, his voice low, deliberate, as though each word had been weighed against some invisible scale. "The night comes early here. You will need to rest." He paused, and she felt a flicker of tension in his tone, not anger, but caution. "Tomorrow you will learn what is expected." She nodded, though her throat felt tight. Questions tumbled in her mind, desperate for answers she knew might not come so easily. What had he endured in this land, alone and unyielding? What stories were hidden behind his quiet demeanor? And what would her role be in a household she had not chosen, with a man she did not know? The room seemed vast, filled with shadows and shapes she could not yet identify. The furniture was simple, functional, made from heavy wood that carried the scent of the forest. On a low table, a few dishes sat neatly arranged, their surfaces gleaming faintly in the firelight. She noticed a set of tools hung carefully on the wall, each with a specific place, each hinting at a routine she could not yet understand. Every detail told a story, yet the story remained incomplete, leaving her curiosity tinged with unease. He gestured toward a small bed in the corner, made neatly with rough linen sheets. "Sleep," he said simply. "You will need strength for the days ahead." There was no offer of comfort, no softening of the command, only a quiet authority that made it clear this was a house where the rules were his alone. She stepped toward the bed, her movements hesitant. Her fingers brushed the linen, stiff and coarse beneath her touch. She could hear the wind sighing against the walls, whispering through the cracks between logs, carrying the scent of pine and dust and smoke. Her heart raced, a steady drum of anticipation and fear. Sleep seemed both necessary and impossible. As she lay down, she found her thoughts wandering to her life before this. She remembered the mornings in her father's homestead, the smell of fresh bread baking in the oven, the laughter of servants and neighbors as they went about their day. She remembered lessons on manners, on walking and speaking correctly, on the importance of appearances and reputation. That world felt distant now, like a dream fading at dawn. The reality before her was raw and unfamiliar, full of unknown rules and hidden dangers. Outside, the land stretched wide and empty, a sea of darkness dotted with the pale light of stars. She could hear the faint cry of an owl, the distant rustle of animals moving through the night. Each sound reminded her of the vastness beyond the walls, the freedom and peril of a land shaped by wind, fire, and relentless sun. And she could not help but wonder if he, the man she was to wed, moved through this same landscape with the same ease, the same certainty she lacked. Morning came slowly, pale light seeping through the narrow windows. She rose, stiff from a restless night, and found him already awake, tending to a small fire in the kitchen. His movements were fluid, a quiet rhythm that filled the room with a sense of purpose. He glanced at her, his expression calm but unreadable. "Eat," he said, sliding a plate of simple food across the table. Bread, some dried meat, and a small portion of berries, meager, but sufficient. She hesitated, unsure of what to do. Her hands trembled slightly as she took the plate, noticing the careful way it had been arranged. It was not lavish, but it spoke of thought and consideration, a different kind of care than she had known in her father's home. She ate slowly, listening to the crackle of the fire and the soft hum of the wind outside. He watched her all the while, silent and steady, as though judging not only her actions but her intentions, the very measure of her character. After breakfast, he gestured toward the door. "The land must be understood. You will learn its ways." She followed, her boots crunching against the dry earth. Outside, the world seemed both beautiful and harsh. The sun glinted off rocks and scrub, the horizon a jagged line of ridges and valleys. The air was crisp, filled with the scent of sagebrush and distant rain. She felt small beneath the wide sky, acutely aware of her own vulnerability, and yet something in the vastness stirred a quiet determination within her. He led her across the land, pointing out features she had never noticed before. Water is life. Know where it flows, and you can endure. He showed her tracks in the soil, marks left by animals, and explained how to read them. Not all that moves is dangerous. Some can feed you, some can warn you. Learn the difference. Each lesson was practical, hard-earned, and she realized that survival here required more than manners or wealth. It demanded knowledge, intuition, and courage. The day passed in a blur of learning and observation. She discovered muscles she did not know she had, felt the ache of exertion in ways she had never experienced in her sheltered life. Yet each task, each lesson, built a sense of connection to this place, a tentative understanding of the rhythms that governed it. She noticed, too, moments of unexpected kindness, a gesture here, a slight nod there, that hinted at a depth beyond the fearsome reputation she had been told to expect. Still, questions lingered, heavy and unrelenting. Why had her father chosen this path for her? What history lay between him and her future husband that she could not see? And what of the man himself? What secrets did he carry? What pains and regrets? What stories hidden behind the stoic mask he wore so carefully? She could feel the tension between them, a fragile thread that might snap or strengthen, and she knew the answers would not come quickly. As evening fell, the sky awash of pink and violet, she returned to the house with him. The hearth was already warm, and the scent of cooking drifted through the air. She watched him work, noticing the precision and care in every movement, and felt a strange mixture of fear and fascination. Here was a man whose world was entirely his own, whose life had been forged by hardship and necessity, and she was being drawn into it step by careful step. They ate in silence, the fire casting flickering shadows on the walls. Her thoughts wandered again to her father, to the homestead she had left behind, to the life that seemed like a distant memory. She wondered if he had anticipated the difficulty she would face, if he understood the courage it would require to live in this new world. And she wondered, not for the first time, if she could endure the unknown, if she could find a place in a life she had not chosen. After supper, he gestured toward a small stack of blankets and a cot set near the hearth. Rest. Tomorrow begins early, she nodded, feeling the weight of exhaustion pressing her down. She lay down staring at the ceiling, listening to the wind sighing through the cracks in the logs, to the occasional snap of a branch outside. Her mind raced with the possibilities of what was to come, the lessons, the challenges, the moments of fear and discovery that awaited her. And then, from the darkness outside came a sound that made her heart stop. A soft, deliberate rustling, almost too quiet to notice. She held her breath, straining to hear, but it ceased as suddenly as it began. She wondered if it had been a trick of the wind, the shifting of animals through the trees, or if it was something else entirely, a sign that the world beyond the walls was as alive and unpredictable as the man she was to marry. She rose cautiously, moving to the window. The night was deep now, shadows stretching long and thin across the land. The stars were bright, cold points of light in the vast sky. Nothing moved, nothing stirred. And yet, she could not shake the feeling that she was being watched, that the land itself, the man, and some unseen force were all testing her, measuring her, waiting to see how she would respond to this new life. Sleep came fitfully, broken by dreams of shadowed figures, of voices whispering her name, of hands she did not recognize reaching for her in the dark. She awoke with a start, her heart pounding, her body tense. The fire had burned low, leaving the room in half-light. The man was already awake, sitting near the hearth, eyes fixed on the flames. He glanced at her, expression calm, and for a moment she thought she glimpsed something unspoken in his gaze, a warning, a question, a challenge she did not yet understand. The days that followed were a mixture of labor and observation, of fear and fascination. She learned to move across the land with caution, to read its signs, to respect its dangers. She discovered the rhythm of life in this household, the unspoken rules, the moments of quiet intimacy that revealed the man beneath the stories. And always there was a sense of tension, a fragile thread connecting them, as if at any moment the balance could shift, revealing truths she was not yet ready to face. Even as she began to adapt, To find strength she had not known she possessed? Questions remained. What had her father truly intended by sending her here? What lay hidden in the history of this man, the land, and her own destiny? And most of all, could she survive in a world so different from the one she had known? A world of both beauty and danger, of fear and fascination, of a life she had not chosen but could not escape? The night fell again, heavier and quieter than before, and she lay awake, listening to the wind and the distant cry of a coyote. Somewhere beyond the walls, in the dark land stretching endlessly under the stars, the unknown waited. And she knew, deep in her heart, that the story of the pale bride, of the feared Apache, had only begun. The wind had shifted by dawn, bringing a crisp chill that hinted at the coming change of seasons. She stood at the edge of the clearing, watching the way the first light stretched across the ridges, brushing the distant canyons with gold. Today, he said, they would hunt, and the thought made her stomach twist. Hunting meant following him into the wilds, tracking creatures she had never seen, testing skills she did not know she possessed. She had learned the basics, the signs of movement in the soil, the difference between tracks left by rabbit and fox, but to rely on her instincts, to move with the land instead of against it, was a lesson she was still trying to grasp. He appeared silently beside her, as if the shadows themselves had brought him there. She startled, though she had expected his presence, and he merely observed her for a long moment, the faintest curve of his lips hinting at some unspoken thought. "Do not fear what you cannot see," he said, voice low and steady. "Fear is wasted energy. Attention is what keeps you alive." She nodded, swallowing her unease. The words were simple, but they carried weight, a quiet authority that left no room for argument. She wondered if he spoke them only to calm her, or if he spoke them to himself as well. There was a stillness in him, an unshakable certainty, and yet, even now, she could sense layers of tension beneath the surface, hints of battles fought and losses endured that he would never share easily. As they moved through the brush, she noticed how attuned he was to the land. A subtle shift in the wind, a faint rustle of leaves, a distant snap of a twig all drew his attention, guiding his steps, guiding hers. She tried to mirror his movements, but her body was stiff, her senses untrained. Each misstep, each hesitating glance reminded her of how much she still had to learn. He did not scold her, but she could feel the silent measure of his judgment, a steady gauge of how well she would adapt to this world that had become hers by decree. The hunt revealed more than just her lack of experience. She saw the harshness of the land in a new way, the way it demanded respect, how survival depended on observation, patience, and sometimes ruthlessness. They came across a deer caught in a narrow ravine, struggling to free itself. She froze, instinct telling her to help, to ease the suffering, yet he shook his head ever so slightly. "Wait, observe. Nature has its own rules. Interfere too soon, and you risk more than you gain." She watched as he moved with precision, ending the creature's struggle with a single controlled strike. There was no joy in the act, only necessity. Her stomach churned, but she understood the lesson. Life and death here were practical matters, not the distant abstractions she had learned about in books. As they returned to the house with the day's catch, she felt a subtle shift in herself. She was tired physically and mentally, but there was a sense of accomplishment mingled with the unease that had become her constant companion. She began to notice the small patterns in his behavior, the careful arrangement of tools, the way he checked the traps, the quiet rituals he followed before nightfall. Each detail hinted at a history she did not yet know, a life shaped by rules and experiences far beyond her own sheltered upbringing. Yet even as she adapted, the tension in the house seemed to thicken. In the evenings, she often caught glimpses of shadows moving in corners she could not name, sounds that suggested life beyond the walls, perhaps visitors, perhaps threats. She had learned to move quietly, to watch and listen, but the uncertainty gnawed at her. The man noticed her attentiveness, sometimes commenting on it, sometimes letting it pass silently. She realized that every moment of observation, every hesitation, every choice, was part of the unspoken education he was imparting. Not all lessons were about survival. One evening she found him staring at the horizon, the firelight flickering across his face, revealing lines of weariness she had not noticed before. "You will need more than strength to endure," he said without looking at her. "You will need patience, understanding, and the ability to see what others cannot. There are things in this world hidden in plain sight." She asked him what he meant, and he only shook his head, returning to his work. The unanswered question hung in the air, pressing down on her, a puzzle she could not yet solve. Meanwhile, the village beyond the hills had not forgotten her absence. Rumors traveled fast in the settlements, whispers that carried both curiosity and fear. Some said she had been taken against her will, others that she had chosen this fate. None could see what she was learning. None could know the complexity of her days spent in the wild, learning rules older than any town council or church. And yet, the knowledge of these rumors added another layer of pressure, expectations she could not meet, judgments she could not escape, a sense that every move she made was being measured against invisible eyes. The Apache himself carried burdens of his own. She began to notice moments when his stoicism cracked, small gestures that hinted at losses endured and decisions that had cost him dearly. A letter left untouched on the table, a glance toward the ridge where smoke sometimes curled in the distance, a faint tightening of his jaw at certain sounds, each suggested a life shaped by events she could only imagine. She understood that fear and respect were not the only forces shaping this man, that memory and duty guided his actions just as much as instinct. One afternoon, while tending to the traps along the creek, she stumbled across signs of others' tracks that did not belong to the animals they hunted. She froze, unsure whether to follow them or return, but he appeared silently at her side. He studied the marks with a trained eye, then nodded, his expression grave. "They are near," he said. "We will see them soon enough." He offered no further explanation, leaving her with a knot of unease that she could not shake. The possibility of outsiders, of strangers with unknown intent, brought a new dimension to the tension that had settled over her life. Even within the walls of the home, there were mysteries. She discovered a small chest in a corner of the main room, its lock old and worn. One day, curiosity overcame her caution, and she managed to pry it open. Inside were items she did not understand, fragments of letters, tools of strange purpose, objects that hinted at a life she could not yet interpret. Each discovery was a glimpse into a past she could not fully know, and each question only deepened the sense of suspense surrounding the household and the man she was to wed. Interactions with neighbors and travelers brought yet more tension. Occasionally a rider would pass, giving her a brief, fleeting glimpse of the world beyond the hills. Their words were cautious, filled with the politeness and suspicion of people who respected danger but could not ignore curiosity. Some asked after her, some offered warnings. Each encounter reminded her that she existed in two worlds at once: the isolated, disciplined life within the Apache's home, and the wider settlement where her absence sparked rumors and speculations. She began to feel the weight of expectations from both sides, and the tension of trying to navigate these conflicting pressures gnawed at her steadily. At night she sometimes heard voices carried on the wind, fragments of conversation from the distant hills. She could not tell if they were real or imagined, if the wind merely twisted sounds into familiar shapes. Yet each night the uncertainty made her cautious, made her watchful, made her more aware of every sound and shadow. She began to keep track of patterns, noting when the wind shifted, when the animals moved, when the house itself seemed to respond to the invisible rhythms of the land. The tension became a constant companion, shaping her thoughts as much as the man beside her did. Amid this uncertainty, small moments of connection offered rare relief. She began to understand certain expressions in his eyes, a subtle relaxation in his shoulders, a faint smile that appeared only when he believed she was not watching. She realized that trust, like survival, was built slowly, through observation, shared work, and patience. Yet these glimpses of vulnerability also reminded her that he was not easily understood, that the layers of fear, respect, and history surrounding him could not be penetrated quickly, and that the conflicts she sensed were far from resolved. One evening, after a long day of tending to traps and preparing the land for the coming frost, she found herself alone on the ridge, looking down at the valley below. Smoke curled from distant chimneys, the sound of a dog barking echoed faintly, and the wind carried scents she could not identify. She felt a strange longing for the familiar world she had left behind, but also a stubborn pull toward this life, dangerous and uncertain as it was. The tension between these two desires left her feeling unsteady, as though each choice she made could shift the balance irreversibly. When he returned, he said nothing about her absence. Instead, he handed her a bundle of herbs and instructed her to prepare them for storage. She obeyed, feeling the rhythm of his expectations pressing against her, shaping her movements, her thoughts, and even her sense of self. She wondered what stories these tasks concealed, what lessons they imparted beyond their practical value. Every action in this household seemed to carry dual meaning, a survival skill and a measure of character, a reflection of the life she was learning to navigate. As the days lengthened and the cold settled deeper into the hills, the tension between them remained, ever present and unresolved. Each moment of silence, each glance, each measured gesture added layers to the conflict she could sense but could not name. She knew that beyond the immediate challenges of survival, beyond the lessons in tracking and hunting, there were deeper forces at play: expectations, histories, secrets, and fears that bound them both to paths not fully revealed. And so she lay awake each night, listening to the wind, counting the stars, imagining the stories hidden in the shadows. Each day brought new lessons, new challenges, new questions that refused to be answered. The land was beautiful and harsh, the man both stern and inscrutable, and the life she had been thrust into demanded more than courage. It demanded vigilance, observation, and a readiness for the unknown. She realized, with both dread and fascination, that the true journey had only just begun, that the conflicts surrounding her between past and present, fear and trust, life and survival, would shape the days to come in ways she could not yet predict. And somewhere beyond the walls, in the endless stretches of valley and ridge, in the shadows of the forest and the whispers of the wind, the unknown waited. The story of the pale bride and the feared Apache was far from over, and the tension that bound them would only grow, drawing her deeper into a world both beautiful and perilous, a world she could not yet control, and a story she could not yet fully comprehend. The sky had turned a restless gray by mid-afternoon, the clouds drifting low and heavy across the ridges, as if the land itself held its breath. She stood near the edge of the clearing, hands clenched at her sides, listening to the wind as it rattled through the dry branches. There was an unease in the air, subtle but undeniable, a vibration that seemed to echo through the ground beneath her feet. Even the animals were restless. A flock of birds took sudden flight from a distant tree, and a coyote's sharp cry carried faintly on the wind. She felt it in her chest, a tightening that made each heartbeat loud and urgent, a signal that something beyond her understanding was coming. He approached silently, as he always did, his movements measured and confident. The tension in his body was visible, a rare and subtle shift that made her stop in her tracks. "Something changes today," he said quietly, his eyes scanning the horizon. "The land does not lie. Pay attention." She nodded, though she did not fully understand, the words carrying both warning and promise. They moved together across the rocky soil, the sound of their boots muted by the thickening wind. She noticed every detail, the way the shadows shifted with the clouds, the smell of wet earth as a distant storm approached, the way his gaze seemed to catch movements invisible to her. The journey led them toward the far ridges, where the terrain became steeper and the path less certain. Each step demanded attention, balance, and patience, and she felt herself straining to keep pace, to anticipate his moves, to read the land as he did. There were moments when she faltered, her boots slipping on loose stones, her breath catching in her chest, and each time he paused, letting her recover, letting her understand without a word. She was learning, but the lessons were harsh, and the stakes felt higher than they ever had. By late afternoon they came upon a narrow canyon, shadows stretched long and dark across its walls. Tracks marked the soil, faint and almost erased by wind and rain, but he moved with certainty, following them as if the path spoke to him in a language she could not yet hear. She tried to interpret, to understand the meaning behind each step, each pause, each subtle shift in his direction. But her senses were still untrained, her instincts raw. And yet there was something compelling in his quiet authority, a sense that survival and understanding were intertwined, that the land itself tested her as much as he did. They stopped near a small stream, the water flowing clear and swift between rocks, the sound urgent and insistent. She knelt, cupping her hands to drink, and saw something that made her pulse quicken. Footprints. Not animal, not familiar, pressed into the damp soil. Her fingers traced the impressions, feeling their depth, the weight of the unknown pressing on her. He leaned close, examining them with a practiced eye. "They come," he said simply. "And soon we will see who they are." Fear rippled through her, but it was tempered by fascination. She wanted to ask questions, to understand the danger, but he offered no explanations beyond the few words, leaving her to imagine possibilities, to measure the threat herself. It was a lesson in trust and patience, and though it unnerved her, she felt herself growing, feeling the first sparks of courage she had not known she could possess. As the sun dipped behind the ridges, casting a golden glow across the canyon, a sound reached them, a faint murmur, then the sharper noise of movement. Figures emerged from the shadows, distant at first, their shapes barely distinguishable in the dimming light. Her heart hammered in her chest, a drumbeat of tension that made the world feel both vivid and fragile. She instinctively stepped closer to him, sensing that he would guide her, protect her, and yet she understood that she would need more than protection. She would need strength, insight, and decisiveness of her own. The strangers approached, cautious, observing, their presence adding a layer of conflict she could feel pressing against her spine. The man did not speak at first, only studied them with a cool, assessing gaze. She saw the shift in his posture, the way his hands flexed, subtly, ready, prepared, a silent signal that he expected the unknown to test him, and through him, she felt the weight of the danger pressing on her own courage. A sudden rustle to their side made her flinch. She looked up, heart racing, and saw a deer freeze in the brush, ears twitching, muscles tense. In the same moment, one of the approaching figures faltered, and a sharp whistle echoed across the canyon. She did not know what to do, and for an instant panic threatened to overwhelm her. But he moved, smooth and deliberate, positioning himself between her and the unknown, and she followed his lead, mimicking his movements, silent and tense. The strangers drew closer, and she noticed details she had not before, the way one carried a bundle that looked heavy, the way another's boots were scuffed and worn from travel, the cautious way their eyes flicked between the land and each other. They were wary, but not immediately hostile. Yet she sensed the tension, the uncertainty that made the air itself feel heavy, as if the canyon held its breath, waiting for what would come next. He stepped forward, voice steady, carrying authority that demanded attention. "State your purpose," he said, and even from this distance she could hear the firmness in his tone, the way it left no room for deception or hesitation. The strangers paused, then one spoke, the words low and cautious, revealing only fragments of intent, hinting at grievances and fears she could barely grasp. She realized then that the conflict extended beyond her personal fears, beyond the challenges of survival. This was a clash of worlds, of histories, of power and respect, and the consequences of choices made long before she had arrived. The canyon seemed to tighten around them as they spoke, shadows lengthening, the wind stirring with a sense of urgency. She could feel the danger, immediate and pressing, yet she also felt a strange clarity, a focus that sharpened her senses. Every detail mattered, the positioning of the strangers, the slope of the rocks, the rustle of the brush, the snap of a twig underfoot. She understood that she was no longer simply observing. She was a participant, a presence that could influence what was to come, even in subtle ways. Hours passed, the conversation stretching with careful tension, each side measuring the other, testing boundaries. She noticed the flickers of hesitation in the stranger's eyes, the faint recognition of authority in his gaze, and the subtle ways in which each movement could shift the balance of power. Her own heart raced, a constant reminder that the line between control and chaos was fragile, and that the choices made in this moment could reverberate far beyond the canyon. As the light faded to twilight, the first drops of rain fell, soft at first, then heavier, pounding the rocks and earth with insistent force. The strangers finally stepped back, disappearing into the shadows from which they had emerged. She exhaled, a breath she did not know she had been holding, and felt the man place a steadying hand on her shoulder. It was not a gesture of comfort exactly, but of acknowledgement or recognition that she had survived, that she had learned, that she had begun to understand the ways of the land and the ways of him. They returned to the house under the storm, the wind whipping around them, the rain soaking their clothes and hair. She felt every sensation acutely, the cold, the wet, the tension lingering in her muscles, the electric sense of anticipation that had not yet left her. Inside, the fire was alive, the warm scent of smoke and wood inviting, yet also reminding her that the challenges of survival were never entirely gone. She realized, as she dried her hands and face, that the day had changed her. Not only had she faced danger in the canyon, but she had also begun to see the depth of the man she was to wed. His strength, his patience, his command over the land and the situations that arose, revealed a world she could not have imagined. A world where courage and wisdom were measured not by wealth or lineage, but by understanding and action. Yet questions remained. The stranger's visit had been brief, but the threat was real. Their motives, their histories, their intentions, she could not know. And even as she sensed growing trust between herself and him, there was an unspoken tension that neither of them addressed, a knowledge that the world beyond the ridges held challenges far greater than those they had faced today. She could feel it in the air, in the restless storm outside, in the way he moved through the house, alert and deliberate, even when the immediate threat had vanished. Night fell fully, dark and relentless. She lay near the fire, listening to the storm pounding against the walls, the occasional crack of thunder making her startle, and she felt the weight of all that had come before and all that was yet to come. Each lesson, each challenge, each small victory of courage had led to this moment a tension so thick that the air seemed almost tangible, a world poised on the edge of change, and a story that demanded resolution she could not yet give herself. She glanced toward him, sitting in quiet thought, and wondered what he saw in her. Did he recognize the fear and uncertainty that still lingered beneath her courage? Did he sense the questions that burned behind her eyes, the longing to understand, to belong, to survive and thrive in a world that had seemed alien only days before? She did not know, but she felt the bond growing, fragile and unspoken, tied to trust, respect, and the shared experience of survival and danger. Outside, the storm raged, a reminder that the land was alive and unpredictable, that the paths they walked were never simple or certain. She understood that the climax of this story was approaching, though she could not yet see it, and that the tension she felt, the mixture of fear, curiosity, courage, and anticipation was a necessary precursor to the challenges yet to come. Every choice, every movement, every silent observation would matter, shaping not only the outcome of the conflicts around them, but the story of her own transformation in this wild, untamed world. The night stretched on, long and unyielding, and she lay awake, counting the flashes of lightning, listening to the drum of rain against the roof, and feeling the pulse of the land through the floorboards and walls. The story of the pale bride of the feared Apache was poised on the edge of revelation, the tension reaching its peak, and the world beyond the house waited with bated breath. Every instinct told her that what was to come would test everything she had learned, everything she had become, and that the resolution, when it came, would not arrive easily, but only after trials she could not yet imagine. The morning came soft and golden, the storm that had roared through the night retreating over the ridges, leaving the air crisp and clean. She stepped outside, feeling the ground still damp under her boots, the scent of wet earth and pine filling her lungs. For the first time in days, perhaps even weeks, the tension that had coiled so tightly in her chest felt a little lighter. She knew the dangers of the land had not vanished, that the world beyond the house could still hold surprises, yet there was a sense of calm now, a fragile reassurance that what had passed had changed her, and him, in ways neither could have predicted. He came out behind her, his movements deliberate, quiet, the weight of his presence both grounding and reassuring. There was no need for words at first. The silence itself carried meaning, a shared understanding that came from facing uncertainty together, from surviving challenges that had tested their courage and patience. She felt it in the way the sunlight glinted off the wet leaves, in the soft flow of the stream, in the vast openness of the land that had seemed so indifferent and yet now felt alive with possibility. He spoke at last, voice low, steady. The storm teaches more than it destroys. You have learned this, as have I. She looked at him, seeing the quiet pride in his eyes, tempered by a weariness she had not noticed before. It was a moment of connection, rare and fleeting, but it carried the weight of all that had come before the hunts. The lessons, the small victories and failures, the tension and fear, and the first sparks of trust that had grown between them. She nodded, realizing that in the time since she had arrived at his home, she had grown in ways she had not imagined. She understood the land more clearly now, knew how to read its signs, to anticipate its dangers, to find sustenance and safety within its vast, wild stretches. She had discovered patience, courage, and resourcefulness, qualities that had been dormant within her until necessity awakened them. And in turn, she had come to see him not only as the feared Apache of whispered stories, but as a man of depth, intelligence, and a quiet, unyielding strength. As they moved through the house to begin their day, she noticed details that had escaped her before the careful arrangement of tools. The faint marks on the walls where lessons had been taught, the small gestures of preparation and care that spoke of a life lived in harmony with the land and with its demands. Each observation reminded her that she had not only survived, but begun to belong. That the fear she had carried from her father's homestead was gradually giving way to understanding and respect. News from the village came quietly that afternoon. Travelers reported that the strangers who had appeared in the canyon had moved on, leaving no trace but a sense of respect for the man who had confronted them. She felt a flicker of relief, though it was tempered by awareness that the world remained unpredictable. Conflict could arise again, challenges could appear at any moment, and vigilance would always be necessary. Yet even in this, there was a lesson learned, the understanding that fear could be tempered by preparation, courage, and the bonds forged in shared trials. In the following days, life settled into a rhythm both demanding and satisfying. She rose early to tend to the hearth and the small garden, learning to gather herbs and prepare food with efficiency and care. He taught her to mend tools, track animals, and navigate the land with confidence. Each task, each shared effort brought them closer, weaving a quiet connection that neither could articulate fully, but both felt deeply. She discovered that respect and trust, once earned, could create bonds stronger than fear or expectation, and that courage was built not in isolation but in companionship and shared experience. One afternoon, while exploring the ridge together, she found herself laughing at a small misstep, a slip on wet stones that sent her flailing into his steadying arms. The tension that had so often shadowed their interactions seemed to ease just a little, and she realized with surprise that she had begun to care for him, not as a figure of fear or obligation, but as a man whose strength was matched by insight, whose quiet patience inspired her confidence. He glanced at her with a hint of amusement, a small acknowledgment of the bond that had grown between them, and for a moment the world felt simple, whole, and unthreatening. Evenings became times of reflection and conversation. They shared stories of their pasts, carefully revealed in fragments, each tale building trust and understanding. She learned of the hardships he had endured, of the responsibilities he bore alone, of the decisions that had shaped him into the man he was. He listened to her recollections of life in her father's home, of the expectations, the limitations, the lessons she had once thought necessary, but now questioned in light of what she had learned here. In these exchanges, the tension between fear and trust, past and present, began to dissolve, leaving space for respect, understanding, and even the beginnings of affection. One evening, as the sun sank low behind the ridges, they stood together on the edge of the clearing, watching the sky turn shades of amber and rose. The wind carried the scent of pine and rain, of earth still damp from recent storms, and she felt a deep sense of belonging, of connection to the land and to the man beside her. The struggles, the fear, the uncertainty all had led to this moment of quiet, shared understanding. And though challenges would inevitably return, she felt ready to face them, strengthened by experience and guided by the trust that had grown between them. The days that followed brought small victories that reinforced this new life. She prepared meals with care, tending to the home and garden, learning to anticipate needs, and discovering the satisfaction of independence within the framework of their shared responsibilities. He watched her with steady pride, occasionally offering guidance but more often allowing her to act, to learn through practice and observation. It was a partnership built gradually, without force, forged in the tension of survival and the subtle bonds of trust. The land itself seemed to acknowledge her growing confidence. Tracks that once seemed indecipherable became legible. Paths that had felt treacherous were now navigable with assurance. She found herself observing signs in the soil, the trees, and the sky, interpreting the world around her in ways that brought both security and a sense of mastery. Each day reinforced the lesson she had learned in the canyon. The world was harsh and demanding, but understanding it, moving with it rather than against it, brought freedom and peace. A quiet moment came one evening when they sat together by the fire, the air filled with the scent of wood smoke and dried herbs. She realized, almost with astonishment, that she no longer felt the same fear she had carried when she first arrived. The man who had once seemed so imposing now felt familiar, steady, a presence that offered both protection and companionship. And she understood that the stories whispered about him, the fear that had accompanied her from her father's house, had been only one part of a much larger, more complex truth. As the weeks turned into months, life in the homestead settled into a rhythm both demanding and fulfilling. She had grown strong, resourceful, and self-assured, learning not only the practical skills of survival, but the subtler lessons of patience, observation, and trust. He had taught her, and she had absorbed, and in turn, he began to reveal more of himself, sharing fragments of his past, moments of vulnerability that strengthened the bond between them. One morning, as the sun rose pale and golden over the ridges, she realized that she had come to see this land, and the man who inhabited it, as her true home. Fear had given way to understanding, uncertainty to confidence, and the tension that had dominated her early days now felt like a distant echo, replaced by respect, care, and even affection. She recognized that happiness, like survival, was not instantaneous or easy, but built through patience, courage, and the willingness to engage fully with the world around her. The village beyond the hills also began to acknowledge her transformation. Travelers and neighbors spoke of her growing skill and independence, of the wisdom she had gained and the confidence she carried. Rumors of fear gave way to respect, and the pale bride of whispered stories became known not for her fragility, but for her courage and intelligence and for the partnership she had formed with the feared Apache. In this, she saw the power of adaptation and resilience, of trust earned and demonstrated, and of the quiet strength that comes from understanding one's place in the world. One evening, as the first snow of winter dusted the ridges, they stood together on the clearing, looking out across the valley. She felt the weight of the past months, the journey she had taken from fear to confidence, from uncertainty to trust. He reached for her hand, steady and sure, and for the first time, she allowed herself to fully acknowledge the bond that had grown between them. There was no need for words. The land, the experiences, and their shared trials had spoken more clearly than any conversation could. She realized that her life had changed not because fear had vanished, but because she had learned to face it, to move through it, and to find strength in the most unlikely places. The man beside her, once a figure of fear and mystery, had become a partner, a teacher, and a companion. Together they had endured challenges, navigated uncertainty, and emerged stronger, their connection deepened by the trials they had faced. As the sun dipped behind the ridges, casting long shadows over the valley, she felt a sense of peace she had never known. The land stretched endlessly before her, harsh yet beautiful, demanding yet rewarding, and she understood that she was not merely surviving within it but thriving, finding joy, purpose, and belonging in a world she had once feared. The pale bride had become a woman of courage and wisdom, tempered by experience and strengthened by trust. In the quiet that followed, she looked at him and he looked back, their eyes meeting with a shared understanding that needed no words. The journey had been arduous, filled with fear, uncertainty, and tension, but it had also brought growth, connection, and the beginnings of happiness. She realized that the challenges they had faced, the conflicts they had navigated, and the lessons they had learned together had shaped a future rich with promise, a life defined by respect, courage, and partnership. The wind softened, carrying the faint scent of pine and frost, and she smiled, a quiet acknowledgment of all that had passed and all that was yet to come. The story of the pale bride of the feared Apache had reached a resolution not through grand gestures or dramatic declarations, but through the slow, steady work of trust, understanding, and shared experience. And in that she found a happiness both simple and profound, a knowledge that the trials of the past had prepared her for the life she now embraced fully. The horizon glowed with the light of a new day, promising challenges and opportunities, yet also offering the security of a home built on courage, understanding, and mutual respect. She felt the warmth of the hearth, the steadiness of the man at her side, and the presence of the land that had shaped them both. In that moment she knew she was truly home, not only in the house or the clearing, but in a life she had earned, a partnership she had nurtured, and a future filled with hope, connection, and the quiet joy of belonging. The pale bride's journey had begun with fear and uncertainty, had traversed the harsh lessons of survival, and had emerged into a life of strength, trust, and love. The feared Apache, once a figure of mystery and apprehension, had revealed his true self through patience, guidance, and the trials of the land. Together, they faced the challenges of the wilderness and the world beyond, building a life defined by courage, partnership, and the quiet satisfaction of a journey completed. And as the stars began to pierce the winter sky, she understood that the greatest lessons of all had been learned not in moments of ease, but in moments of tension, challenge, and shared endurance. The land, the man, and the life she had found were intertwined in ways she could not have imagined, yet now could not live without. The pale bride had found not only survival, but a home, a partner, and a future rich with the promise of joy and fulfillment. A story that began with fear but ended in hope,